Hello once again and welcome to another one of my tutorials. In this one we're going to be talking about a structure in the brain known as the thalamus. And the thalamus is a structure that you're bound to come across when you study neuroanatomy. It has many connections and it's kind of impossible to talk about the functioning of the brain without kind of mentioning the thalamus in a number of different examples. It is kind of complex. It's essentially a bunch of nuclei that are kind of stuck together in a ball, and that makes it quite complex because it means it has lots of inputs and outputs. But in this tutorial I just want to concentrate on the important thalamic nuclei for medics, so we're going to talk about just those relevant ones that I think are relevant to medicine in particular. The thalamus exists in a brain region known as the diencephalon, which is a term used in embryology and it means between brain. So it kind of means between the cortex and the cerebrum and the brain stem and the midbrain. There's two important structures in the diencephalon. One of them we're going to talk about here, that's the thalamus. The other one is the hypothalamus. There are some other structures as well in the diencephalon, but I think they're less important. So the thalamus and the hypothalamus are the two important structures. So let's actually have a look at where the thalamus is. We've got a coronal section of a brain here, and we can see the thalamus is fairly centrally placed here as number 2, outlined by the purple box, and we can see it in relation to the cortex and the subcortical white matter of the cerebrum, which is number 1, and below in the red box we can see collectively the brainstem with the midbrain, pons and medulla being numbers 3, 4 and 5 respectively, and then below that number 6 is the spinal cord. So the thalamus is a paired structure, so we'd expect to see a left and a right thalami. It is sitting, the left and the right that is, sitting either side of the third ventricle, and it is joined together, the left and right thalami, joined by a structure known as the interthalamic adhesion. And a little bit of trivia is that in about 16% of the population they don't have the interthalamic adhesion, so there's no connectivity between the left and the right thalami, and this has no consequences whatsoever and is usually an incidental finding at some point if ever it is found. So this is the thalamus, and it's worth at this point to mention a little bit about its function. So the thalamus is really a target for all sensory information, so for sensory inputs. Coming towards the cortex, but we must remember that doesn't include olfaction. In fact, olfaction has a slightly different route because it's phylogenetically quite an old special sense. It means that it doesn't relay through the thalamus at all, but it goes straight to cortical regions, and that's a kind of separate story altogether. So we must remember to admit olfactory information when talking about sensory information coming to the thalamus. In addition, the thalamus is involved in integrating and modulating and gating the flow of information from one part of the cortex to another. So we must remember that it has these roles in what we call modulation and integration of information, as well as acting as a relay. And we often say the term gateway or gatekeeper of the cortex. I think often it's a misconception that the thalamus is fairly passive in the process of relaying information to the cortex. We must remember that it does play an active role. It can control, it can attenuate sensory signals, it can be selective about the type of information that is allowed to reach the cortex. So it's not just a relay centre. So here we've seen the general anatomy of the thalamus and a brief overview of its function. Let's now draw a diagram of a thalami, and on this slide I'm going to draw it resembling an egg shape. So I'm going to draw one, it doesn't really matter whether it's left or right, and I'm going to draw this up, this Y shape down the centre, and this Y shape is going to represent something known as the internal medullary lamina, and I'm just going to abbreviate that at the top here because this slide is going to get fairly busy. So the internal medullary lamina is this Y shape that separates it out into different parts. I'm going to refer to this side as the lateral side and this side as the medial side. And we can call these three different regions that we've made here inside the thalamus as anterior, lateral and medial. Sometimes they're called tiers, so sometimes you might see that certain parts of them are referred to as tiers, but that doesn't matter. We're just going to use this terminology at the moment. So when looking at this structure, I think it's important to label the individual nuclei that belong to this lateral group, and the reason for that is because it contains most of the sensory information that comes from the spinal tracts, and the spinal tracts are really important in neurology and understanding of basic the principles of deficits of function when we have problems with lesions or injuries to the spinal cord or to the brain. So first of all, we can draw in a number of different nuclei. So I'm going to label this side. This is the VA nucleus. This is the ventral anterior nucleus. I'm going to draw in this other one in here, which is the VL nucleus. This is the ventral lateral nucleus. And I'm going to draw on another region in here, which is collectively known as the VPL, and a region in there which is the VPM. And I'm going to draw a little block that comes off the back here, which is quite important, and I could spend all day colouring this in. I wish I kind of hadn't started that, but I feel like I need to complete it now. So let's colour that in. That's going to be what we're going to call the LGN, and that stands for lateral geniculate nucleus. So let's just run through those again. We've got the lateral group, which is the VA, which is the ventral anterior nucleus, the VL, which is the ventral lateral nucleus. We've got the VPL, which is the ventral posterior lateral nucleus, and the VPM, which is the ventral posterior medial nucleus. And then at the back here we've got the LGN, which is this block coming off the back, and that is the lateral geniculate nucleus. Now collectively we can say that all of this group down here, certainly down to there, is known as the ventral tier. And I mentioned that term tier before, and just to help you understand some of the textbooks that describe this, it will avoid some confusion, I think. So these are quite important, and I'll tell you why. The VA and the VL are associated with relays from the basal ganglia to the cortex and the cerebellum to the cortex. And these are the cerebellar cortical loops and the basal ganglia motor loop. The basal ganglia motor loop, of course, important in Parkinsonism, and with conditions such as ataxia, we obviously have problems associated with the cerebellar loop coming from damage to either the cerebellar pathways or parts of the thalamic nuclei involved. So here we've got the ventral anterior nucleus and ventral lateral nucleus associated with the circuitry of motor control concerning basal ganglia loops and cerebellar loops. This one in here, which is both the VPL and the VPM, now this group is really important for medics. It's the important information that comes through the voluntary sensory tracts from either the head or from the limbs and the trunk. So anything coming from the body will go to the VPL, and sensory information, general sensory information coming from the head will go to the VPM, and the majority of that of course will come from the trigeminal nerve. The LGN is important for the optic pathway. So the LGN is a relay for the optic pathway, and that's important for your medics as well. The others are less important. They're generally involved with limbic functions. And just to summarise, we've got some nuclei which would exist in this medial group, and they would receive inputs from the limbic system, and eventually they would relay through nuclei, the dorsal medial nucleus, which I don't think is that important, but would relay through there to the cingulate cortex and the prefrontal cortex, and this is inhibiting inappropriate behaviour and mediating executive function. In the anterior group up here, now this is quite interesting but probably not that important for medics. This is actually part of the Pepez circuit, and this anterior nucleus coming from here would eventually relay to the mammary bodies, and from there would relay back to the cingulate cortex, and this is part of the loop that's involved in memory consolidation from the hippocampus. But I think they are less important because the motor and sensory information that's relevant, I think, to basic neuroanatomy at medical school is really around these lateral nuclei and the relay of important sensory and motor information. So that summarises the thalamus. I hope that was useful. Bye for now.
Subscribe to Soton Brain Hub for more videos to help explain the mysteries of the brain.